In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus talks about forgiving each other our debts. And obviously, we have debts in terms of money that we owe each other. And I think there probably is some real element of that in our lives, that we should be gracious in our finances, forgiving debts that we're owed. But this is also a word that has a secondary meaning that goes back into some of those more ancient Semitic languages that Jesus probably spoke and used conversationally in his ministry. That secondary idea of debts as obligations, responsibilities, what do we owe each other as neighbors, is probably what he has in mind here as he teaches us how to pray. We have opheilēma, our debts. And as I mentioned, this is very much a financial term. In Greek, its primary meaning was to speak about money that you owed to somebody else. Therefore, to be forgiven of that debt was just as simple as being told you don't have to pay it back. That's what it was about. There is, however, a later secondary meaning. And that secondary meaning was actually derived from how the Greek word was used to translate an old Semitic word. See, our boy Matthew here is in kind of a tough spot. The audience for all of the Gospels really was primarily Greek-speaking. At the time of Jesus, and increasingly over the next century, even Jewish communities were being Hellenized. That meant they were beginning to speak Greek as their primary language, and they were even being kind of Greekified in their way of thinking about the world. So, for example, Paul, when he quotes from the Hebrew scriptures, generally does that quoting from something called the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation of the Old Testament. And all four of our Gospels are written in Greek, because that's what the audience could read. Even though Jesus primarily spoke in Hebrew and Aramaic. That means Matthew isn't just writing down what Jesus said, Matthew is translating what Jesus said into a new language. That's even before we come along millennia later and try to translate that Greek now into English. Now, Jesus absolutely would have spoken Hebrew anytime he read scriptures, and likely anytime he prayed in a liturgical setting. But conversationally, in Galilee in the first century, it's probably, for the most part, in conversation and even in public teaching, Jesus would have been speaking a related language called Aramaic. And we know this because there are a couple points throughout the Gospels where Jesus uses lines that are really puns that really only work in Aramaic. One of the famous ones comes later in this Gospel, chapter 23. Jesus is critiquing some of the religious leaders because they're getting too caught up on the rules. And he says, look, you guys would strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. It's a good line. Really provocative image here. But it's a really good line when you realize that in Aramaic, the word gnat is the word galma, and the word camel is the word gamla. So you strain out a galma, but you swallow a gamla. That's a really good line. Well, something like that is probably happening here. You see, debts, opheilēma, spoke about financial arrangements, but it was also the Greek word used to translate the Aramaic word koba. And koba could mean financial debts, but it had a broader meaning. It could also mean your responsibilities. So you can still think debts, but expand that in a broader, more relational community sense. What do I owe you as a friend? What does a parent owe in responsibility to their children? It's part of community. What is your duty to the whole, to your neighbor, to the stranger in your midst? What do we owe each other as human beings? That's what koba was about. And that kind of debt is very likely not just the idea, but perhaps even the specific word that Jesus was using when he first offered this prayer. Forgive us those responsibilities we didn't quite live up to. As we learn to let go of those expectations that perhaps we've held over each other for a little too long. There's a profound grace in that, right? It's not just, forgive me the terrible things that I've done. It's God, forgive me all the little things I lost sight of, which seems small to me, but maybe wasn't for someone else. Maybe the times everyone got a spring break except for my daughter, and I didn't notice until bedtime. Still, there's another way to think about this on the other side, because maybe you've done this. Have you ever held on to a slight for a little too long? Maybe someone said something and it was an offhand comment, but over time, after you repeated it to yourself enough, it began to take on gargantuan proportions. It became a sin that demanded retribution, but then when you had a chance to talk to that person, they didn't even remember what you were talking about. By the way, that doesn't mean for a second you should just let it go, or that it didn't matter, or that it didn't hurt you. In fact, when we've hurt someone, even unintentionally, but we injured someone, it's a profound kindness when they come back to us and they let us know so that we can change our habits. But in the broader sense of our debt to each other, in the sense of learning to let each other off the hook for what is owed, I think perhaps what we come to understand is that forgiveness isn't just the ways that someone has wronged us or injured us. It's for all the ways that someone has let us down. Perhaps even the ways that someone has failed to live up to our expectations for them. But the truth is, forgiveness doesn't lie only in objective reality. It lives in the space between us, which is often kind of fuzzy. I've been married for 24 years now, and one of the things I have had to learn is to forgive even when my wife hasn't done anything wrong. See, sometimes the problem isn't actually that Rachel did something. The problem is I'm holding on to an expectation that wasn't met. And if I keep holding on, thinking I'm owed that debt, if I don't find a way to get past it for me, then I'm the one who's going to suffer for that. Here's an example. It's a silly one. But I remember, this must have been a decade ago. I was with my son, who was an infant at the time, and I was sitting in a coffee shop when he started crying. And so running through my mental checklist, I went to plan A, which was to pull out a bottle and mix some formula, give him a snack, and that seemed to work. However, while I'm doing this, a person comes up to me and offers me a suggestion. They said, look, formula is never the best option. Milk is always better. Maybe you could ask your wife to pump before you leave the house. Now, I didn't feel like explaining that my kids were adopted, and so they were going to be getting a lot of formula regardless of our pumping strategies. So I just said thanks and went back to working on whatever I was doing. Here's a question. Do I need to forgive that person? Well, in one sense, of course not, right? They haven't done anything wrong, maybe a little aggressively helpful, but in no world could I ever possibly describe that interaction as sinful. And yet, if that person was a part of my life and they're part of this community, if I saw them regularly, then yeah, I probably would have to let go of that interaction. It's been a decade and I'm still talking about it, so clearly there's a little work I've got to do in here. But this is my point, right? Sometimes to forgive is important for our well-being as it is to be forgiven. Which is precisely, I think, why Jesus links these things together.